Welcome to This Jungian Life. Three good friends and Jungian analysts, Lisa Marciano, Deborah Stewart, and Joseph Lee, invite you to join them for an intimate and honest conversation that brings a psychological perspective to important issues of the day.
I'm Lisa Marciano, and I'm a Jungian analyst in Philadelphia.
I'm Joseph Lee, and I'm a Jungian analyst in Virginia Beach, Virginia.
I'm Deborah Stewart, a Jungian analyst on Cape Cod.
So today we're going to have an interesting podcast episode. We're going to talk about a particular pivotal point in Jung's young life when he was struggling between one of two different careers. This very unexpected struggle inside of himself happened somewhere during the visit with Freud in 1906, I believe it was, in Vienna. Jung at this point had been working with Bleuler. He had a sense of himself as a psychiatrist, but there was underneath the surface a very serious internal conflict of whether or not his life was on the right path. And then after a seminal experience in Vienna, this really came to crisis, and we're going to talk about the other life that Jung could have led.
Oh, the unlived life.
His unlived life, indeed, and how he ultimately found some way to integrate these various interests inside of him.
Why don't you tell us about what happened in Vienna, Joseph? What was it that was so important?
Take ourselves back in time. It's 1906. Carl Jung is a really bright, really charismatic 30-year-old man. He's been corresponding with many people, including Freud. He's brimming with complexes, really powerful dreams. And he's on that train from Zurich to Vienna. He has his suitcase. He's carrying the word association test results he wants to talk about. He's got his ink-stained notes, all this anxious enthusiasm
I just want to say, Deb and I took that train, didn't we, Deb?
Yeah.
Yes. So
Yeah.
I can really picture it as you're talking, Joseph. Go ahead.
And of course, they had been corresponding for months. Their letters were crackling with this intellectual intensity. Jung was electrified, Freud is intrigued, and they're meeting at the epicenter of Viennese civilization, which at that time was the Café Sacher. And there's a famous little line in one of the letters that Freud wrote: "We will meet where the ego is least repressed beneath a thick glaze of chocolate."
Oh my gosh.
Isn't that charming?
That's really great.
People don't think of Freud as being that funny. So Jung arrives. He is wearing this very sober wool suit. He's a guy who's ready to found a new psychology, so to speak, or join Freud in that. And Freud's seated in this corner table beneath this portrait of Emperor Franz Joseph, and he rises and greets Jung really warmly, and he says, "Dr. Jung, I've reserved the most neutral table." And then the waiter approaches, and before Jung could order mineral water, which he normally would have, Freud says, "2 Sachertortes, the real kind, not the ones from the bakery down the street. Those are for hysterics." So it was very funny. And Jung, who had never had a Sachertorte, assumed that was some kind of term for unconscious repression. He had not heard it before. what arrived was this kind of glossy, layered, unknowable object, which turned out to be this dense chocolate confection pierced by a sliver of apricot. And it sat there like a dark, mysterious archetype on the porcelain. And he took one bite, and time slowed, and this warm silence, fell over his inner landscape. And the apricot and the chocolate and the cream and this crust that was so delicious kind of whispered this secret experience to him. And then he looked up at Freud just wide-eyed and he said, "My God, this is like the self."
Wow. Oh, my goodness.
Freud narrows his eyes and says, "No, it's the pleasure principle."
Oh, my gosh. Right at the beginning, they had
Yes.
that. Oh, my gosh. The total difference that would divide them later. Right? Oh,
Right
that's
there.
amazing.
There it was, right in that
Amazing.
cafe in Vienna. Yeah.
So the seeds of the conflict, the seeds
Wow.
also of something else that began to grow inside of him. And so the Sachertorte became the conjunctio positorum.
Hmm. Well, and it is too because it has the sweetness of the chocolate and the creaminess of the whipped cream, and then also the slight bitterness of the apricot.
Mm-hmm.
So
Mm-hmm.
it really is that conjunctio, that tension. Yeah.
We're talking really about Jung's experience with the transcendent function. That amazing revelation where everything just comes together, transcends your conscious awareness, reality. I mean, you're fully present, but something much larger arises. And what I love about this is that it unites body, spirit, and mind
Yeah.
in the taste of the Sachertorte.
The chocolate, the apricot, the whipped cream. It's like alchemy.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah. And in fact, there are some people who believe that Jung's interest in alchemy was really kind of primed by his interest in pastry and confection. And just Joseph, that was such a beautifully told story. But I do want to just back up a little bit because
Yeah.
what we know now is that Jung had such a lively mind as a young man. His father had said at one point, the problem is he's interested in everything, and that was true. He didn't know how to narrow down his interests when he was finishing up, kind of what in America is called high school and getting ready to matriculate in college. He had to choose a course of study, and it was very, very difficult for him. He was interested in the natural sciences. He was interested in archaeology and mythology and the humanities, but he was also a very, very talented pastry chef.
Mm-hmm.
And that was a real interest of his that he gave some serious consideration to.
Well, I think he was the son of a pastor, a country pastor, did not have a lot of money. And somewhere along the line, we all know that for all of his life, Jung loved good food. He loved sweets. He loved good wine. And, there have been hints and rumors that while he was at university, he worked part-time in the kitchen and learned about sort of bread baking, pastry making, all of those delicious kinds of treats. At night, he was young, he was robust. You get up at 2:30 or 3 and start the baking ready for breakfast and coffee the next day. But I think, it was pretty rudimentary stuff at a university, unlike this revelatory experience with Freud, who somehow knew to take him to a cafe. of all the places they should meet, it would be at this famous Viennese cafe.
It's very synchronistic, isn't it?
Incredible.
There's Jung holding this tension inside of himself. And then as soon as he gets there, Freud's saying, we're going to the Sacher Cafe. I mean, it is so uncanny to put him right into the middle of it.
Just to provide some historical context, I mean, we have to remember that at the turn of the century, like Zurich it didn't have much of an established pastry culture, right? I mean, if you were interested in pastry, there were really two places on the planet, that you would want to make sure to go. One, of course, was Paris, and the other was Vienna.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
So, we think about Jung kind of making this pilgrimage to Vienna to meet with Freud, but really it's clear if you read some of his kind of newly discovered letters and writings and that kind of thing, that a big part of what drew him to go to Vienna at the time was to experience the pastry culture in Vienna, which was world renowned at that time.
Right. And he had been introduced to this when he had previously gone to Paris to study with Pierre Genet, a noted psychologist. He had been just working at this mental hospital in Zurich and really, really wanted to go to Paris. His nickname in college had been the Barrel. So, we know he already developed an appetite for sweets and good things. Off he goes to Paris. And once again, he had very little money. He had a salary at the Burkhalsee, and his boss, Eugene Bleuler, would not give him a leave of absence to study. So off goes Jung anyway to Paris to study, but he needs a moonlighting job, as it were. And because of his experience at university, he got a job at a cafe and a pastry place in Paris. And once again, you get up kind of in the middle of the night. Jung is young, he's robust, he can do both the moonlighting and his daytime studies. And guess what he concocts? He was the one that decided to put chocolate in a croissant.
Mm.
And he called it the Barrel because it is sort of round with this layer of chocolate underneath. It later became known as a chocolate croissant. But Jung was the one that inspired the creation, sort of the refinement of it. And I think that really fired his passion for pastry, which then, as you were saying, Lisa, later took him to Vienna to meet Freud as a cover story, really, for wanting to experience Viennese pastry after having tasted what Paris had to offer.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, cover story. I think he did genuinely want to meet Freud. I just think, it had sort of a dual purpose,
Yeah, it was a busman's holiday.
And another little funny story is you were talking about Jung's nickname as the Barrel, but once people understood his kind of culinary skills, they used to call him the Fasskuchen, which is basically the barrel cake.
Oh.
So, Fasskuchen.
Yeah. I think from time to time, his love of sweets, pastries, good food. I've never heard anything about his fasting periods, in between these trips and experiences of indulgence. But there's definitely a tendency there to overindulge, and we all know what happens if you do that.
Yes, we all become Fasskuchens
Yeah.
around our midsections. So there's a pivot point. He's already been experimenting with some things, and like you said, that he had developed a kind of archaic version of what was going to become the chocolate croissant.
Mm-hmm.
And I think later in life, he understood that even the inspiration to create the chocolate croissant had come up from an archetypal layer of the psyche. As a matter of fact, he had had a dream that he didn't understand when he was quite young, rather. And
Young Jung.
yes, exactly. That he went into a vast oven that was deep beneath the Alps. And inside there was this kind of radiant baker who wore this intricate crown made of sugar cubes. And the baker whispered to him, strangely enough in French, "Transformation begins in the kitchen."
Oh, wow. That is archetypal, though. I mean, the hearth is, our modern kitchens are emanations of the hearth. Wow.
And followed by a remarkable demonstration where the alchemical, for lack of a better word, the alchemical baker took this enormous egg, probably it was like the size of an ostrich egg, and he breaks it, and it kind of slops onto the pan. And then after a few minutes, of course, he's scrambling it, and it turns into scrambled eggs. And Jung spent years and years meditating on that image, and that became the inspiration for Solve et Coagula.
Oh, for heaven's sake.
The liquid that coagulates had been demonstrated to him in this dream beneath the Alps.
You know, the thing about pastry baking actually is that it's not quite candy making, but it's closer to that than many other things. It's kind of highly technical,
Mhm.
and you have to actually know quite a bit about food science, as it were, to really be an excellent pastry chef. You know, like the temperature of the dough and how it's going to respond if it has more butter versus more sugar. What does sugar do to the dough, for example? It's very, very technical, and I think in that sense it really is alchemical. It really is like Jung in the kitchen, pouring over different batters, trying to get something, just perfect something, and get it just right. It's very similar to what the alchemists were doing when they were trying to experiment with their alembics, turning the base metal into gold. And Jung talked about how the what happens in alchemy is that the alchemists were projecting psyche onto matter, which
Mhm.
I think was exactly his experience when he was in the kitchen working with pastry, is that it was really sort of like an extended active imagination, right? Where he just unconsciously was projecting psychic material onto the puff pastry dough.
And you have to really pay attention to it, incorporating butter slowly, rolling out the various layers of pastry. It does require a tremendous focus and attention to working the materia. And we work with, in alchemy, work with the material substance in order to achieve its transformation. And it is patient work, just like the alchemists always said their work was. And if you do the work patiently and with attentiveness, the hope is that we will activate the spirit in the matter. I mean, personally, I can't think of any better way to achieve a kind of spirit than something that is hot and fresh and flaky and buttery and sweet and chocolate. I mean, we all know that experience of like, it makes transformation and transcendence accessible,
Yeah.
And
right?
digestible. Yeah.
Exactly. So it is a concretization, but it's also so symbolic of the bigger, deeper spiritual process.
As a funny aside, when Jung was really angry at Freud, and before he wrote his final letter, and that ends with something like, and after that there is only silence.
The rest is silence.
The
Yeah.
rest is silence. But he had written this sarcastic little note to Freud where he was commenting on their initial meeting at the Sacher Cafe. And I don't remember all of it, but he did a kind of biting analysis of the Sachertorte. He said something like, the glossy, controlled exterior of the Sachertorte hides a dark, luscious interior, not unlike the Victorian superego's repression of instinct and desire. So that was his just, really angry comment, that Freud himself was like a glossy chocolate coated pastry, but inside, was all of this repressed energy. Later on in a small monograph, he did an analysis and also talked about the apricot jam inside, gave it a tart, unexpected note, which he came to call the anima spark, that there's this surprising encounter with the inner life underneath the layers of conformity.
Wow.
And then in the final bit, I think he says something like it's kind of a comment on the bourgeois culture that the Sachertorte's reputation as an elite dessert maps onto the persona of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which itself was poised on the edge of disintegration while clinging to refinement.
Yes.
He really found a lot in that metaphor.
Wow. But I'm thinking about this, that maybe the flip side and another sort of sweet revenge, as it were, on Jung's part, is that the inside shadow part of the Sachertorte is also delicious, so that it's a counterpoint to Freud's feeling about shadow is just the personal darkness and the sort of slag heap of repression that we have to slog through. And Jung's point is, but it's also where the treasure is to be found.
Mm-hmm.
And that most of the shadow is pure gold, or in the case of his pastry, pure delight, pure sweetness, pure transcendence. So he really makes really important symbolic point. And just one food item that is splendid. And it takes revenge on Freud, because this is Freud's hometown, as it were, Vienna. And he takes this thing from Freud's life and makes it into something much better, more complex, and transcendent. It really exemplifies how he was contesting Freud, competing with him.
Jung's love of the Sachertorte, and especially as you were talking about, Deb, the kind of ooey gooey inside of it. That is, it's when they were discussing that Freud mentioned that Jung, he warned Jung to beware of the black tide of occultism, right? But he was referring to the blackness of the inside of the Sachertorte.
That's right. He was tapping on it with his little fork there in this very exemplary way. Yeah.
This is such a great example of the symbolic life and the kind of world in a grain of sand. Because you think, oh, it's a Sachertorte. It's just an item you get in a pastry shop. Oh, no. It's much bigger, much deeper, and more multifaceted than that.
And this is the beginning. I think many years later, he coined the term living a symbolic life.
Mm-hmm.
But he was already delving underneath these, what might have seemed like an inconsequential experience, eating a sort of Sachertorte. But it meant so much more because he was reaching inside himself to find other layers of meaning to these extraordinary things that he was experiencing inside of himself.
Yeah.
I just want to go back to this moment that I brought up before where he's trying to decide what to study. He's got the possibility of studying the natural sciences, the possibility of studying humanities, and then he's also feeling really pulled to continue with his pastry studies. And it's just been something that's always been there. And I'm going to just read a little bit from Memory Stream's reflections, as we like to do on the podcast, because he had a dream around this time. He was really struggling with this decision, and I just want to read the dream. He said, "Then came a second dream. And again, I was in a wood. It was threaded with watercourses, and in the darkest place, I saw a circular pool surrounded by dense undergrowth. Half immersed in the water lay the strangest and most wonderful creature, a round animal shimmering in opalescent hues and consisting of innumerable little cells or of organs shaped like tentacles. It was a giant radiolarian measuring about 3 feet across. And he said, it aroused in me an intense desire for knowledge so that I woke up with a beating heart."
Wow.
So, and he interpreted it that at the time in MDR. In any case, he mentions, that it sort of settled him to study science, but the story is not actually that simple, because when he awoke from that dream, he wasn't sure if it was a living creature and it was an indication to study science, or if it actually had been an image of a sort of giant,
A macaroon.
right, a macaroon.
That he had
Yeah.
this, he loved macaroons, those wonderful little chewy confection sandwiches almost, that you can have. Yeah, at first, actually, he thought it was a macaroon, a translucent macaroon, which in and of itself was strange, and it was like enormous. It was like an 18-inch across macaroon, which
Wow.
also was highly shameful to him.
Yeah, I think that's why it didn't make it into the published version of MDR. But if you look at some of the original protocols that are coming out, there is this discussion about, whether it was a macaroon and whether that was actually, an intimation from the self to move toward becoming a pastry chef.
And such a gigantic image, I think, could also be, that he would have dreamed of something, a macaroon that's like 3 feet across. That's not the kind of thing you really want to delve into in terms of your own shadow in a dream interpretation of that. Could it be that big? Could it be that grand? Could it be that much? Could it really have that kind of satiating power? So I think the temptation to sort of symbolize it differently is totally understandable and works. I mean, that's what dreams allow, multiple lenses through which to understand them.
And it's so interesting, because I can totally see that image as a giant macaroon, right? Like macaroons have that sort of delicate coloring oftentimes, and
Yeah.
when you see them in shop windows, they're so they're so entrancing. And here's this kind of magical macaroon in the middle of the forest, so.
And it would have a living quality to it. I mean, he came to think of it as a radiolarian, but, in the dream world, things are very strange, talking horses and singing macaroons.
Swimming macaroon.
And the macaroon is a kind of Eucharist, really, as an enormous Eucharistic feast.
Yeah, that's great. That's great.
Promising renewal, birth, death, and resurrection.
I want to sort of keep us tracking Jung's passion for baking and pastry. Was lifelong. And that after his transcendent experience with the Sachertorte and Freud, the next thing that happened some years later was that they took a trip to America with Salvador Ferenczi. There was a sort of competitive spirit between Freud and Jung. And where do they go? They go to Worcester, Mass., which is basically in the Boston area, home of the Boston cream pie. And they were guests of the president of Clark University's home, and they served local treats. And Jung was really smitten with the chocolate of the cake part of a Boston cream pie, and then there is a filling between the two layers that's creamy. But it's not just whipped cream. It is a multitude of other things that are really fantastic. And Jung, this was new to Jung, and he tinkered with the recipe, but he made it smaller. He made it like, I think the radiolarian reminded me of this, of instead of 3 feet in diameter, this was more like 3 inches in diameter, of 2 chocolate cake layers and the cream filling in between that would later become known as the whoopie pie. But there he had a little handheld treat that he could tuck away in an inside pocket or a desk drawer and have something sweet and pastry-like. The combination of textures, colors, and flavors that was the hallmark of Jung's work in the kitchen.
I think that's really moving. The idea that he would make these little sustaining treats for himself, and that he would then tuck them into his clothing in different places to take care of himself. It's almost like food for the little mannequin that he had as a child. It's like that little mannequin-sized pie.
Well, I think it just speaks to the man's extraordinary, prodigious creativity and flexibility, and just he was so good at so many things.
He was a polymath. Yeah.
Polymath, Renaissance man.
He made beautiful art, we all know from the Red Book, and these gorgeous ideas that he was so full of, and, founded a new psychology, and was a really brilliant pastry chef. I mean, that combination doesn't come around but once every few centuries.
Absolutely.
It's a unity of body, mind, spirit. He loved to work with his hands.
Mm-hmm.
He loved being in the kitchen, the archetypal hearth. He loved alchemy and the amount of real focus and attention that pastry like alchemy requires. You're right, Lisa. I mean, it does speak to Jung as just an astonishingly multifaceted genius, and a genius for life in all its forms.
And I think that it gives us another way in. It gives us another way. There's so many sort of doors you can walk through to begin experiencing Jung. You may get smitten with typology, and that's your exposure. Or perhaps you really like tarot, and that's your exposure. Or perhaps you enter in because you love myths and fairy tales or dreams or alchemy. But this is another way in too. And I think maybe it's a good time to let our listeners know that we're going to be bringing forward soon, within the next year, a cookbook. We are going to be publishing a book of Jung's pastries. It will have, original recipes, with annotations by us. And, we really hope that will help listeners find new access to Jung and his really extraordinary ideas.
Yeah, we can cook things up in all kinds of ways, symbolically and also in the kitchen.
Yes, we were inspired by a book that Sonu Shamdasani had put out, which is, I don't have the title exactly right, but it's something like Knowing Jung Through His Bibliography.
Mm-hmm.
That he had done this analysis of the sequence of Jung's books. And so we were noodling this over, and Lisa had come up with this same idea of knowing Jung through his recipes.
Yeah. It's very intimate.
It's very intimate. There's also another really funny story that when Jung was more advanced in age, and particularly coming up and down the stairs of the house was really difficult for him, that he had trained his little dog named Gebäckkoch, which really means pastry chef in German, to carry a little basket up into the consulting room with some of his confections. And so in the middle of most sessions, you'd hear this little scratching on the bottom of the door. And then this little dog would kind of hop in with a basket in its mouth and then offer it, to Jung and whoever he was working with. And then they would have a little kind of tea and treats there. So it became something really charming that people delighted in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So lots of good things happening. Our cookbook is going to be coming out. We've been thinking about names for it. We haven't really landed exactly on what that might be.
But, actually, we'd love to hear your thoughts about what we should name it. So
I love
please, please share that.
That is a great idea. Yes, help us get to something really wonderful to honor Jung's spirit and genius in the kitchen in the way that his genius in other areas has been so appreciated.
Yeah, we are so proud to be helping to unearth this forgotten legacy of Jung's.
And in closing, from all of us to all of you,
April Fools!
Thanks for listening. To submit a dream, suggest an episode topic, or join our mailing list, visit our website, thisjungianlife.com. If you enjoyed this episode, give us 5 stars and a good review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Subscribe to our YouTube channel and make sure to click the notification bell to be alerted whenever we upload videos. And keep up with all things TJL by following us on Instagram, Facebook, X, and TikTok.